I'm Dr. Brad Hafford, archaeologist and economic anthropologist. Welcome to Nook, where I take a close look at a banknote from the relatively recent past. In this series, I'm analyzing paper money from around the world, paying close attention to one example in each episode. I'm covering money that's no longer in circulation and comparing what it tells me to what I can find out about the country's history and culture. As an anthropologist, I'm more interested in what money says than what it's worth. And it says a great deal about the government that issued it and the people who used it. I've researched the notes as much as I can, but there are still some symbols, imagery, or text that I might be misinterpreting, and there might be words in other languages I mispronounce, for which I apologize ahead of time. Nevertheless, examining the note carefully should lead us to some interesting discoveries. Today, we look at a 5-franc note issued in 1943 in the Anglo-French protectorate of the New Hebrides, later to become the island nation of Vanuatu. We begin by looking at the obverse, or front of the note. This side typically emphasizes the issuing authority and often carries an image of an important person from the country. This one doesn't quite follow that pattern, though, because it's what's typically called emergency money. The Second World War was in full swing in 1943, and armies mobilized all over the globe, financed through emergency fiat currencies. Emergency money was printed quickly and was typically not as intricate as normal issued currency. It also tended to have fewer security measures. This note, for example, has a simplified design of geometric lines and minor text to make it easier to issue quickly. It has a background of green and an overprint of dark blue, but almost no pictorial elements. Since the islands were jointly administered, it might have been difficult to choose a person who could represent or at least be recognized and acceptable to all the potential users of the money. Some currencies get around this by depicting indigenous flora or fauna instead, but this one barely does even that. The only pictorial element on the note is 2 feathers that flank the central denomination of 5 francs. They appear to have their stems cut as if to be writing quills, and they likely represent the feathers of the Vanuatu megapode, Megapodius leardi, also called the New Hebrides scrub fowl. This is a bird species found only in Vanuatu, and feathers like these are often found on headdresses used in traditional Ni Vanuatu dance. So they may be the only representation of the island's environment and culture on this note. Whereas normal issue paper money tends to highlight such aspects as reminders of cultural unity and monetary acceptability, emergency notes emphasize almost solely the utility of the printed paper as a circulating economic tool. So it's difficult to know exactly why the feathers were chosen and exactly what they represent. They appear only in outline as part of the dark blue overprint that is made up primarily of text in the French language. This tells us the issuing authority, Service National Français des Nouvelles Hebrides, and the circulating value, bon pour 5 francs. 5 francs was the lowest denomination paper currency issued in the islands at the time. The issuing authority was clearly French, but a variety of currencies were in use in the New Hebrides before the war, including British and Australian. During the war, the islands were nominally under the control of the French Free Forces. So this emergency 1943 issue is entirely in French, despite the British not having given up their colonial interest in the islands that still bore a rather British name. As with most paper money, the obverse bears signatures of financial officials, including the resident commissioner for France and the cashier accountant, despite there being no bank mentioned, only the contrôle du franc. The overprint blue also carries a border design, straight and curved lines that frame the note. At the top center of the frame is an outlined croix de Lorraine. It's a heraldic 2-barred cross. This emblem dates back to the 12th century with the House of Anjou. It was the emblem of the Lorraine region of eastern France by 1871, and in the Second World War, it became a rallying symbol for the French against the Germans, who had annexed part of the Lorraine region long before. As such, the heraldic cross also came to represent the French Free Forces led by Charles de Gaulle. This is clearly why it was chosen as part of the design in the emergency military issue of this note. The serial number is also struck in blue in 2 places on the obverse. And all of this is printed over the green background print, which has 2 elements. First is Nouvelles Hebrides, printed many times back to back so that they end up making a nearly solid cover across most of the bill. Although simple, the small text is so closely printed that it would not be simple to duplicate, and it serves as the main protection of the note against counterfeit. But there is a subtler green print as well. If we look closely, we see a dotted web of lines in lighter green behind the words and all the way out to the edges of the note. This has the effect of blending in with the paper almost to appear to be a watermark. But there is an actual watermark in the paper as well. Unlike many watermarks on paper notes, where there is an obvious blank portion through which any user can expect to see an image with backlighting, this one has the watermark only at the very edge. It has a curvilinear design and it looks very much like writing. Though I don't know what it says, it looks to be in the Lao language or in Cambodian, Khmer. The French issued notes for their Pacific Island colonies through the Bank of French Indochina, which included Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. So let's now examine the reverse. The back of a note typically emphasizes the laws that authorize or protect it. Here, however, that pattern is again not followed. Instead, we have generally the same background and framing devices that were found on the front, but they center on a blank green oval. The blank area would typically signify a watermark, but instead it almost seems that the original design intended to have an image in the oval, but it was simply filled with solid green to expedite printing. The letters NH in the box above the oval stand obviously for New Hebrides, or Nouvelles Hebrides in the French, which we again see printed repeatedly across most of the note in the background. The dark blue overlay has even less text here, solely marking the denomination, and even that is abbreviated. It's written in the same manner as on the central front, but with a few extra embellishments beneath. There are also a few differences to the frame lines. They frame the oval that was not on the front, and the lower portion of that oval bears hatch marks in a hexagon. Despite the lack of figural decoration and the hasty emergency printing, the note maintains an elaborate feel due to the intricate framing, tiny repeated writing, and the dotted web-like patterns that fill the background. It would not be the easiest emergency currency to forge, which was a common enemy tactic, but it also seems to say more about France than it does about the islands of the Ni Vanuatu people. That might be expected for colonial currencies, but most did at least attempt to acknowledge the local culture, the people who would be using the money. So what can this note tell us about the New Hebrides in 1943, and how does that compare to what we know about Vanuatu from history? The New Hebrides are a stretch of 13 principal and nearly 100 smaller islands in the Pacific Ocean, east of Australia and west of Fiji. Melanesian peoples settled the islands some 3,500 years ago. In the 18th century, the French and then the British encountered the islands. It was Captain Cook who called them the New Hebrides, naming them after the islands off the western coast of Scotland. Both the French and the British laid claims to the New Hebrides, and in 1906, they reached an agreement to administer them jointly. This led to many problems, with essentially two separate governments that met only occasionally in a joint court. And locals were not allowed citizenship in either of the controlling countries. For many years, the islands were rather chaotically controlled, and the locals were typically not treated well. In the Second World War, the overall population of the islands was somewhere around 40,000, but very quickly it more than doubled as 50,000 American troops arrived, built two large naval bases, and then utilized them in the struggle against the Japanese. As many as 10,000 local Ni Vanuatu formed a labor battalion to aid the U.S. forces in the war effort, particularly during the Guadalcanal campaign. The interaction with so many new people and new customs had a big impact on local culture, but almost as suddenly, the war was over, the bases and the soldiers were gone. The episode transformed some religious practice on some islands into cargo cults. The term cargo here represents material goods and wealth, and the belief system holds that the cargo will come from outsiders, almost literally dropped from the sky, as it had in the war, particularly in the John Frum cult, which had been practiced before the war but took on stronger aspects of a cargo cult after it. Some followers build ritual airships in the hopes of attracting cargo. The note does not reference any of this. If it were the only evidence we had of the time and place, we would think that the French controlled the islands alone. We might understand that it was the French free forces because of the Croix de Lorraine, and that they were fighting in the World War, but there is no specific indication of the war effort, and barely any indication of the island culture or environment beyond the name itself, New Hebrides. The feathers might be a reference to the locals, but this is one case where we have to dig very deeply into history to understand what was going on, with few clues from the money itself. I hope you enjoyed looking at this banknote with me. I'm Dr. Brad Hafford. Join me again next time on Nook, part of my series, Money Talks.